Welcome, everybody, to our latest installment of Client-Side Chats, approaching mobile application UX and UI to delight users. We have a wonderful panel discussion set up today with some really great points that I think you're going to find really helpful for anybody who's looking for better understanding of the process for building out a mobile application user interface. So let's get going here today. What are client-side chats? For anybody who is maybe new to our thread that we've been running for the last few months, client-side chats provide a platform for Savas Labs and our clients to showcase the ways in which we've collaborated together so that we can share our industry knowledge and expertise to help others learn about new technologies and tactics to support their organizations, maybe understand the processes and pitfalls within implementing those, but really just to build a network of like-minded professionals looking to make an impact using technology. So what does that look like for us today? Well, a couple different things. We are going to be going through the Tornado mobile application project that we worked with Philip and Dowu on to give you a really good foundational understanding and maybe a good real life example of a mobile application user interface design. We're going to use that to walk through the process of how its user interface was actually created and give you the opportunity to ask some questions and get answers about mobile application interface design and how it can make or break user engagement and overall delight of that user. But first, a little bit more about Savas Labs. Savas Labs is a highly skilled team of designers, developers, and consultants that build digital products that create meaningful impact. We're an agency based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, but we're distributed throughout the United States. And we love taking on projects like these that allow for us to flex some of that creativity, but also solve for technical problems that anybody might have. With that, I would love to introduce our panel today and help you just learn a little bit more about the people who are going to be speaking. So first, Philip and Dowu. He's the founder of Tornado, with the goal to create a product and service that intertwined his two major passions, music and entrepreneurship. And with backing and resources from cross-industry professionals, Philip is bringing to life the Tornado application. Philip, thank you so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Mark.
Yeah, definitely. And next up, I would like to introduce Simon Goodwin, a senior UX designer here at Savas Labs. He's responsible for the strategic direction of user interface design for our clients. And he's been in the field of UX design for over 8 years and has helped design websites and applications for companies like Sprint, Ford, and Sherwin-Williams. Simon, nice to have you again.
Thanks, Mark.
And then finally, Drew Glover is a UI UX designer here at Savas Labs who spends his time designing creative user interfaces for our clients. With a decade of design experience spanning both print and digital, Drew's creative touches have helped brands ranging from startup to nationally recognized organizations stand out. Drew, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. I'm excited to be here and talk about it.
My name is Mark Hirschberger. I'm the growth director here at Savas Labs, and I will be emceeing this panel discussion today. But you are going to get to hear a lot more of these three, and I'm excited to be able to walk you through just what the next hour is going to look like for us. So we are going to start off with that foundation and that context of the project that brought us all here today. So we're going to talk about Tornado and learn a little bit more about how we approach that work. We're going to use that, though, as the really base element for us to go into our panel discussion, where we're going to walk through the process for actually designing a mobile user interface. We will be saving time at the end for questions with the audience. So if anybody here has any questions that they came into this discussion really looking for answers on, or if they have any questions that pop up as we go through any of these different milestones and discussion points, please throw them into that Q&A section in Zoom. We are going to be batching all those up at the end, and we will spend time answering those, making sure that you get a really good idea of just anything that you were looking to learn. We'll wrap things up at the end with a few additional resources to make sure that the information, the learnings that you have are actionable afterwards, and that'll be today. So I would love to be able to hand things over quickly to Philip. Philip, can you tell us a little bit about what Tornado is, what the idea behind it was, maybe what led you to want to create this app, and how you ended up working with Savas Labs to get this user interface designed?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so as he said, my name is Philip Dowu. I am the founder of Tornado. My background is actually not in music at all. My background is primarily healthcare operations. I'm currently in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University, completing a master's in public health. to run operations here. But my second passion, or outside of healthcare, has always been music. I'm a musically inclined person. I've played about 5 different instruments. I have traveled Europe and North America playing in different symphony orchestras. I'm originally from Nashville, Tennessee, so Music City, USA. So music is definitely a huge part of my life. And with that being said, I constantly listening to music, constantly exploring different trends, the new industry revelations within music development. So I guess that would lead into last year. One of my favorite musical artists is Adele. I can't think of many people who don't love Adele, but I think the last time she released an album prior to last year was 5 or 6 years in the industry. If you know anything about musical releases, usually artists try to release new projects every year to 2 years or whatever. So Adele is one of the few artists that release their music very sparsely. So when she just released her previous album, it was a big build up, and she did, I believe, a live concert with Oprah, and it was televised on CBS. And just like any other fan, I'm always curious to see what new music is available, what new projects are being worked on. And after she gave her performance in the interview, she was talking with Oprah, and she was saying, "Oh, I have all this released or unreleased stuff that I want to share with the world, but through label restrictions and other musical industry politics, she's not able to share that." And the whole time I was thinking, wow, that'd be really cool to have a platform that's not necessarily dedicated to streaming, but to have an overall example of unreleased music, I guess, behind the scenes interviews, stuff like exclusive content you really couldn't get anywhere else. So after the interview was done, I sat there and I thought, and I called one of my business partners. I said, "Hey, I'd like to really design an app or a program to be added to like a Spotify or an Apple Music that is dedicated to exclusive content for like unreleased music and any other specialized stuff for the artist that they wouldn't be able to release anywhere else." So from there, just started looking around. I was doing some Googling. I'm not really well versed in any type of mobile application design or implementation. So I was doing some Google searching, and I was trying to decide which company I wanted to go with. I reached out to a couple, and then they weren't really necessarily the fit. And then I came across Savas, and I went through their case studies. It seemed like they could deliver everything that I was wanting to do from what I can think of in my mind. And so I reached out, had an initial conversation with Riley, I believe, and then the rest is history. And we were able to go from there very quickly. So that is from start to finish how Tonado began.
Wonderful. Thank you, Philip, for walking us through just the early stages of figuring out what that idea is, how some of that inspiration comes to life, and then some of those initial next steps that led to where we are here today. I'd love to be able to use that foundation for the rest of today's discussion and have us be able to call back to Tonado a couple different times here as we walk through this process of actually designing a mobile application user interface. So let's move forward into our panel discussion today, the meat of today's session, where we're going to talk through some of those different milestones that you go through and what it takes to move from one phase to the next in creating that. And really, it first starts with defining your minimum viable product. Because as anybody who has an application idea in mind knows, there's a lot more functionality that you want to have in your application as it first goes live than you really can fit into it. So figuring out what you actually need to start with is really important. And that first really starts with understanding the users. So Philip, I'd love to bring you back in here right away and just ask, what did you do to fully understand your users and their needs before establishing the idea or maybe the framework of this application?
Absolutely. So I knew what I wanted on the platform, but what I want doesn't really matter. It's what really the fans want and the users who would be using Tonado would want. So in order to gauge that, I did online polling. I asked, that's through several social media channels, my own personal ones, through friends, family, colleagues, industry professionals. I had them share the poll kind of saying, if we were to introduce Tonado, what would you like to see? And the basis was exclusive content. So the users had an idea of what they wanted to see from the artist if they were to sign up for Tonado. So yeah, just social media sharing. I definitely was able to get in contact with a few industry professionals from Apple Music and YouTube as well as Google. And they were able to kind of define what was needed. And also thankfully actually had a response from several stadiums across the United States that were giving me a kind of a hint of what they're seeing in terms of ticket sales and what users or users, concert attendees really wanted to see. So that's usually the basis. So go ahead and sharing that on social media and asking through the various channels like that.
It's an incredibly important part of things that I think a lot of app designers, developers think about. I'd love to take a look at it from the agency side, from that UX side of things. So Simon, why is it so important to understand the user when you're defining that MVP, and how will that direct your user experience designs that you ultimately build?
Understanding the user is essential to figuring out what should even go into the MVP. Oftentimes when a project is brought to us, there's usually either a budgetary constraint or a timeline constraint. So what we have to do is we have to figure out that bare minimum amount of functionality needed in order to deliver that valuable customer experience to them. So knowing our users helps us to define what features to include in the MVP that's going to drive users to actually engage with this app right out of the gate. This also kind of helps us to prioritize a roadmap of improvements that can then enhance this base experience that we're going to deliver. And then using like an iterative design approach and development approach, we can then create enhancements from there. But overall, it's important to know that you need to know the entire scope of something in order to figure out what is that base functionality that's going to bring value, and then how can we build on top of that in a way that makes sense to users and makes sense developmentally in order to be able to continuously provide enhancements that are only going to make things better without confusing people.
Yeah, road mapping, iterative design, really centered on what that user needs and when they need it. That's really interesting and important part. Drew, I'd love to be able to pull you in from that UI design perspective, right? Is there anything that you're starting to do or consider for your design ideas as you learn more about the users in these early stages?
Yeah, definitely. At this stage, I'm trying to get as much information as possible to corroborate what we're getting from the client. So that's the activities like researching similar companies or industries, websites, applications, whatever that takes, and make mapping the landscape that project is going to be built within. It's kind of like a little competitive audit, although it's much less formalized, but making that mental map starts to point me towards some expected design decision points and things that we could purposefully align with or diverge from, depending on the client goals and how they want to be perceived. At this stage, this kind of research can also start to give us an idea of anticipated behaviors and patterns that we'll also need to be aware of as we start to build out more solid ideas.
Definitely. So we're talking about ideas right now, right? Whether that's Philip from your side, really speaking directly to your users, taking your ideas and marrying them with yours. From the designer side of things, starting to collect all those and prioritize them. I'd like to spend a little bit more time in that area of prioritizing these functions. And Simon, designing and building applications is something that you've been doing for a while. So what are some ways that you like to approach application owners like Philip to help suss out those gotta have from nice to have functionalities, both from a design perspective, but also maybe from an application development perspective as well?
Yeah, I generally like to start off by asking for an elevator pitch of the product and or of just this project in general. An elevator pitch is meant to be a super concise statement that's as informative as it can be within just 1 to 2 sentences. And oftentimes that's going to help us figure out that core functionality of whatever we're doing. Then oftentimes I'll talk about all of the other functionality that they would like to include in whether this update or a brand new app, and figure out like kind of what is viable, what needs to be pared down and stuff. What is that key functionality, right? So key functionality is, I define it as something that would, if it was not included within the app, it would create a considerably worse or even an unusable experience for the user. So the key functionality, it will not function without it. After we kind of figure that portion out of what is the MVP and what are maybe a couple of nice to haves, if everything's going really smoothly, we can add in 1 or 2 of those and potentially include those in the initial release as well. But oftentimes what we'll do is at that point, we'll have that conversation with the client and our development team to estimate a level of effort and delivery timelines and see kind of how things need to adjust.
Yeah, so really bringing the process of prioritizing together, not necessarily just trying to figure out like, okay, what is the most important thing, but also starting to look at what is it actually going to take to build this? And are we 100% sure from that development standpoint that this is the best route? And taking into consideration some of those future team members is a really important part. So that's great to understand. Philip, I'd love to just ask you quickly from a project perspective, how did you decide on the key functions for Tonado's MVP?
Yeah, deciding the key functions was probably one of the more easier parts, mainly because what I wanted to do is anytime you're building, I do know this much is when you're ever building a new application, it's hard to do anything brand new. So you want to do something that is familiar to the user, but also something that's unique in your own way. So I wanted to definitely mimic already existing platforms, music and social media platforms like Spotify, like Instagram. If you'll notice on all of them, they all have similar base functions. You have a home button, you have your normal feed or a feed, whatever, home feed, whatever you want to call it. There's always a search option so they can able to navigate the platform. And then they have a personalized section where they can able to keep their content that they have acquired or looked through within the platform. So that had to be the basis of what was included in Tonado.
Yeah, definitely leaning on some of the leaders within the industry already, leaning on some of the UX design that's been done in the past with similar competitors, really helpful starting point for you to move quickly into what do you want it to be unique, and then how do we move forward. Speaking of moving forward, once we have that MVP established, we really are now getting into that point where we have to build an information architecture. So Philip, as you were just touching on there, you wanted to start to organize some of your content and some of the functions into a system that will allow for people to better navigate something eventually. So Simon, how did you approach bucketing Tonado's functions within the architecture established? And what can other application owners take maybe from that process that you took?
When it comes to structure, oftentimes we will start off at that base level functionality, or what might be the biggest buckets that other nested functions can live under. And we'll treat it from that point as if we were just building out an information architecture for a website. You just flip it upside down because navigation is generally at the bottom of an app instead of at the top, like a normal website. For tonight, we already had some of the base functions. Like Philip already said, he had some very strong ideas of what our base functions could be. And that made it really easy for us to kind of have that starting point. And then from there, we were able to add in a lot of the smaller or more detailed functions and flows to live under those base functions that we turned into that navigational piece.
So flows, I think, is something that I heard right there. That's a really important thing that starts to come from that information architecture, right? Finding the different paths that people might take and making sure that those paths are easy to actually execute. I'd love for the entire group to ask this question. How do you decide on the right tab count or maybe structure for any specific mobile application that you have? What's that look like from a best practice perspective, as well as just organizing your own stuff?
Yeah, I'd say the answer is vague and unhelpful in some ways. Hopefully it's still helpful though, but it should have as few tabs as you can get away with while still maintaining complete clarity for the users. So if the buckets and the labels mean something to the user and they understand what they're going to find underneath that label, as few of those navigational tabs along the bottom as you can, that's the answer. But if it's going to make sense to have an extra one in order for it to make sense, that's the right answer. An app does best with 3 to 5 navigational tabs along the bottom. These will be our buckets. So when we're starting off with an app's architecture, there are generally 2 gimmies. Philip already talked about one of them, which is that home or dashboard. That's where that generic feed is for you. And oftentimes you're going to have an account or a profile. So those are 2 that are already just those are set in stone. There are some outliers and ways to kind of design around those, but for the most part, those are the 2. And then we came up with, for Adagio, we had 3 other tabs. So for a total of 5. But then, like I said, labeling, I'm going to be honest, I think labeling is one of the absolute hardest parts of app creation, because you have these buckets, but apps don't quite have that same visibility as websites where you have like a drop down or a mega navigation that provides some of this visibility and exploration. You just have to hope that they click on it and hope that it informs them of where they're going. So I think the labeling is actually one of the hardest parts, and then making sure that these buckets make sense for users.
So we spent time talking about establishing the information architecture. As we look at this slide, right, this is a really good example of trying to organize some of the different pieces of the overall application in a way that will make sense, allow people to go through the main user flows that you expect in a way, like Simon, you had said, that they can quickly understand without maybe having a lot of context clues outside of iconography and maybe a single word, right? That means in my mind that there's a lot out there that can be left up to interpretation and maybe misinterpreted by users. And I'd like to use that as an opportunity to maybe just pause us in this process and point out that there are steps that different web and mobile application developers might skip in the process to help people move faster towards taking something live. And I'm talking really about the idea of user testing. So here at Savas Labs, user testing is a really important part of our process to ensure that the work that we're doing is actually going to solve the problems of the users that we've spent so much time learning about. With that in mind, Simon, I'd love to ask, why is it so important to take an iterative approach to user experience design, even in the early stages of information architecture, where all we have is like buckets and functionality ideas?
Yeah, user testing, I think, is often thought about either just in like a researching customer phase or validation, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this discussion. But there are way more stages that you can user test, and one of them is at this stage of information architecture. And one of the reasons for testing early and often is to course correct. We're checking to make sure that we're staying on the correct course. If it's a new app, we want to make sure that we're continuously focusing on the right features to bring those value. If it's an update, then we're constantly checking to make sure that we're either actually fixing the problem that needs to be fixed or providing a meaningful enhancement that is actually going to mean something to users to an app that's already out there.
So I'd love to maybe follow up with that on that question too, Simon. And I think that there's some people on this call that would love to know maybe a little bit more specifically. How do you like to test some of these ideas that are starting to form just during these early stages? Like what are some things that you do that maybe others could maybe take away from this?
At this stage, because it is still pretty early, so we're still going to incorporate a lot of surveys, which is that preliminary user research to see what people are needing or having trouble with without necessarily looking at anything. Or if we want them to look at something and actually test something out, you can do something called tree testing, which is going to kind of help you figure out if your buckets are actually filled out with the correct stuff, or if any items found that you have placed within a bucket maybe needs to be moved to a different bucket. So that's just one of the ways that you can kind of get that affirmation from customers that you're moving forward in the correct way.
There you go. For anybody who's looking to maybe do a bit more research after today, tree testing is probably a great Google search to hit up. So we have built out an information architecture. We verified it with some of the things that Simon just talked about through some of those user testing and research. But that information architecture comes from our understanding of the MVP and our users. Now it's time for us to actually begin to wireframe out that application interface. And what will be kind of that initial deliverable in this stage is going to be something that we call a low fidelity wireframe. So Simon, where do you start when it comes to creating an initial set of wireframes for an application? Are there any tools or processes that support both you, but also any other people in that design and development process?
There's lots of people in the design and development process. We like to include our UI designer. It's always nice to have a developer at this stage too, just to bounce ideas off of them and make sure that we're not creating anything that's not going to be deliverable or just flat out can't be done. So lots of people involved. And where to start? Oftentimes, I usually start with that information architecture to help inform where to begin. And I usually begin with some of those high-level buckets that we've already talked about. From there, I will start to spell out a user flow using something like FigJam is what we use at Savas. I have used stuff like Miro or Mural in the past. Those wire user flow creation tools are exceptionally helpful at making sure we're understanding every step of the flow, so then you can assign a screen to that step in the flow, and you can figure out how many screens you actually need to create. Once we know what screens to create, I'll start generally at those top level pages and then work my way down through each of those detailed pages of a flow, and then I'll try and finish an entire flow and then move on to the next flow.
I hope everybody was taking notes. That was a really good rundown of kind of that initial approach. Some great tools in there as well, FigJam, Miro. For anybody who's looking to kind of take on some of these on their own, that's a great starting point there. I'd love to be able to take a step back though and take a look at it from the client side of things. Philip, at this point in time with us building out these wireframes, it was your first moment where your idea for the application was now in that low fidelity mockup, right? Kind of the thing that we see on the left side of this screen. What were some things that you did or focused on when reviewing Simon's first pass to make sure that your vision was being done justice?
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting experience to see the bare bones of what Tonado was. Again, I had no prior experience or knowledge of anything, so I was looking at it from brand new eyes. What I really wanted to focus on though, I wanted to ensure that there was that flow, there was that familiarity. You're going to hear me say that a lot throughout the rest of this chat, is familiarity for the users, making sure that it makes sense, that they're able to, at least at the bare bones of it, go from one tab to the next. The functionality is somewhat easy to understand. It's not overly complicated. Does it give me the feel like other applications that I have used? As mentioned earlier, you don't want to have 3 to 5 tabs, pretty standard. If you look across all social media channels, really, you'll be hard pressed to find anything that varies out of that or deviates out of that norm or that standard. So I just wanted to make sure that it felt right, and without any type of visual design, to see the bare bones of it, everything looked good. So, but that was what I was focusing on primarily.
It's so interesting, Philip, that you say that maybe you didn't have the technical background in some of these things, but it's very easy to see that you spent a lot of time taking existing applications to school. And I think that's a really important key takeaway for anybody who's looking to build or manage and evolve an existing app, which is just really make sure that you understand the environment, have a really good vision for what you like that's already out there and how that might be incorporated into your user interface that you start to create.
Right. So definitely, as I said, or might have mentioned briefly earlier, the whole idea for Tonado was not to be a standalone application. It was to be integrated with an already existing platform like a Spotify or Apple Music. So you want to mimic as close to it as possible, but having, again, its own unique identity, just so it's able to be easily, engineers can be able to integrate it with their already existing platform. But that was the whole idea. Still wanted to have its unique identity on its own, just in case it wanted to be a standalone application.
Definitely. So as we look at the screen here today, that low fidelity wireframe is on that left-hand side. What we might call a high fidelity or close to it design is going to be on that right-hand side. Simon on our team, our UX designers, is very much the owner of that left side, that low fidelity, making sure that we've got the things in the right spots that are going to support that user experience. But Drew, as our user interface designer, is very much the owner of that right-hand side. So Drew, what are some of the most important features of a good wireframe that you can rely heavily on as a UI designer, and why?
Yeah, it's something that you might not expect because it's usually not visually represented in wireframes, but it's annotation. We can't always count on the purpose of a screen or page being immediately self-evident. Annotations cover a wide range of uses, and they're basically just notes alongside of a wireframe. That can be things such as including notes about where a button should link out to, where text comes from, planned interactions, transitions, or animations, or even calling out potential constraints to be aware of as we start to interpret those wireframes into a more visual design phase. It's not only good practice when you have 2 different people as the UI and UX designer working together, but in the case of a project where you're going to be going on and passing off these designs to a developer, these notes also help developers get a chance to stay in the know early on about design decisions and gives them a chance to provide insight into those and feedback before we're even thinking about coding them.
So what I'm hearing there is similar to what Simon was saying earlier in this section. Having the right tool set is very important to make sure that the collaboration is very easy to be had, but that the notes and the history of things is very easy to be seen too, so that people can go back to that and work off of it.
Yeah, definitely. It's all about that continuum of information and maintaining as much knowledge as needed to be able to pass smoothly from phase to phase without losing that original idea.
There you go. Design still requires the written word to be had. So it's important for that communication, that collaboration, whether that's with the team, whether that's with the client, to make sure that the vision is starting to come together. Speaking of something coming together, I want to take another pause here in this moment to start to highlight another key area, which is user testing. But at this point, it's now validating user flows. Right? We have this low fidelity wireframe. Most people, Simon, think that user testing is done with high fidelity mockups, right? The stuff that we see on the right-hand side here. But can you share with the group why that's not always the case and what kind of testing can be run with wireframes? And I mean, maybe make an argument for why you think it should be happening then instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's never too early to start user testing. Oftentimes what you can do at this stage is run people through kind of a non-branded screen. It's pretty basic, but what you're looking for is the flow of the screen and the placement of items on the screen to make sure that those are correct before you start really taking the time to put together high fidelity designs and you start utilizing a design system around that. But then you're able to like make sure that the architecture of a page is correct and understandable for users.
Definitely. So, Drew, what kind of information are you looking for in this user testing that utilizes wireframes that could help you prepare for the actual interface design?
Yeah, when we're looking at user testing, I am basically looking for either signs of affirmation that the users are able to find what they need or signs of any confusion or inability to find what they need. Both of those are indicators are just as useful. The overall, I mean, I love wireframes because they allow us to engage users without that additional consideration of visual design, which kind of activates a different part of the brain, especially when you're trying to think analytically about content and versus how that content looks. So dividing those and providing the appropriate table setting of context of what a user is looking at is really important. But also without that, iteration becomes much quicker as well without that consideration of visual design too. So we're able to kind of integrate those changes, get things to a solid place of understanding. And then once we feel confident in what we're seeing from the users, we can basically start to develop those elements visually rather than from that structural standpoint.
And that's a great transition into the final area of our conversation today. So we have now wireframes that we've built out. We validated the user flows again through some of that testing and research. All of that is, again, based off of information architecture we've established, based off of the MVP that we knew we wanted and was needed based off our user research. So now it's the fun part. This is the part where Drew gets to be very creative, and this is where he shines. So, Drew, when it comes to applying branding, right, how do you approach connecting the idea of an application, right, to its brand that it has and the UX wireframes that were provided and still create a unique and compelling interface like this one?
Yeah, thanks. Oftentimes in projects, we start the visual design phase by creating freeform compositions, which we call mood board, and we use those to explore visual design ideas. These tend to work really well regardless of whether or not there's already an established brand that we're working with or if we're modifying or creating one from a more blank slate. This activity is intentionally kept loose and separate from that wireframing and that phase and those thoughts of how they're going to be systematically applied onto that wireframe. But we take these mood boards, we confer with the client on the explorations and start to build consensus towards an aesthetic. And then once we have that forward momentum, we start to think analytically about it and apply it with an eye towards the actual visual design of the product. Again, I love wireframes because they're scaffolding, not final layout decisions. They give guidance of where we want particular kinds of information to show up and the connections between that. But then outside of that scaffolding, there's a lot of room to design around that with the application of brand shapes and type styles and color and all those fun little visual elements that start to fill the gaps.
So, Philip, as the owner of the idea for this application, what did you find to be helpful when it came to getting the vision for how it would look out of your head and into Drew's designs? Help us understand that kind of mental process.
Yeah. So mentally, I had an idea of what I wanted to incorporate inside of Tornado. I wanted it to be a little bit warmer. I wanted it to have a more exclusive look. I've had friends who are graphic designers who will just say, we'll use Spotify. Unfortunately, Spotify, even though they're one of the first music streaming, in a lot of people's opinion, the design of it is not as visually appealing as others, such as maybe like an Apple Music or Amazon Music. So I definitely wanted it to feel more visually pleasing and warm. So from there, I had just some design elements that I personally liked that I was like, okay, I think this would be more visually appealing. And then as I will always say, I said it, and Drew and Simon, it appeared. It was honestly the craziest thing. I'm still shook, even looking at it now, seeing it again. I would say it, and then immediately they were able to take what was in my mind and bring it to life. So that is a credit to both of them and how talented they are.
It's really interesting to hear, right? Drew talking about the idea of mood boards and establishing that aesthetic. For you, Philip, taking what you had in your head and the idea and vision and finding a way to make it truly a reality through Drew's designs. One thing that we haven't really spoken a lot about, and I think it's worth taking a step back and talking about, is the idea of accessibility. I'd like to hear from both our designers here. When we talk about considering accessibility within UX and UI design, what does that actually look like in action? Can you even maybe define accessibility for us?
Yeah, so we often talk about accessibility in terms of color contrast and font sizes. And while those are key aspects of designing for accessibility, it's a much greater umbrella of activities that goes into making something accessible. And then it also, you don't want to be tacking those thoughts onto the end of the design phase. It needs to be more integrated into your whole thought process. In general, you want to kind of start having it. You want to have it in the back of your head before you even start putting marks on a screen. Considerations like what environment you're designing for, like whether it's a website, an app, or maybe it'll appear as both, and then what established behaviors users might already be familiar with, which are things we've kind of peppered throughout this conversation already. I mean, something such as creating a coherent and hierarchical information architecture is designing for accessibility, because that coherent system of information makes it easier for everyone to understand, regardless of any potential disabilities a user may have. And it also helps make use of assistive tools easier for those who need them.
Yeah, and I'll tag on just some additional stuff of, I mean, ideally an app would be utilizing a design system, but just making sure that within the design system, things like making sure all of your buttons look clickable, or like button, nothing that it doesn't have like no underlined text or anything, but it's actually clickable, something like that. Utilizing breadcrumbs if necessary. And then there's actually quite a few things that we as designers can just kind of help to remind developers if they aren't thinking about it, and making sure things like alt tags for images or ARIA labels for screen readers and things like that will help make the app all that much more accessible, which again then increases your core audience by that much more.
That's a really good part to bring up, right? Is because accessibility maybe is considered much more generally as just making sure that people know how to navigate it properly, find where they need to go. But there is that certain element that is meant to make sure that anybody who maybe has a disability can find their way through that, can still interact with your application, especially if your application is looking to be used by a large group of the population, right?
Yeah, definitely. You want to consider accessibility less so as something you need to do to just as an accommodation, but more so something to unify the experience of all users. So you're kind of, it's like that rising tide lifting all boats kind of phrase to be described it, because even for users who may not need any assistive software or have any disabilities that may impact the way that they interact with technology, it's those building in with those accessible practices for everybody is going to make that better for regardless of how you're going to be interacting with it.
Definitely. And I love the way you talk about interacting with it too, because that brings up another question that I have related to this section again that we've talked about already, which is the idea of user testing again, right? We now have a high fidelity wireframe, or not even a wireframe, high fidelity design at this point that we can start to test with our potential users so that we can start to optimize for engagement. So why is it important in your eyes that mobile application interfaces go through validation testing, and why are maybe clickable prototypes better than static images. Drew, Simon, I'd love your guys' thoughts here. And speaking of static and non-static, here's a cool thing that the team put together as well for y'all to look at while they answer that.
Again, this is crazy design. I'm still shook. 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10.
Love it.
Yeah.
I was gonna.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll chime in real quick, but I think that much like what Drew said earlier, visual design activates different things in a user's mind. So it's gonna evoke some new emotions. It's hopefully going to provide a lot of enhancement to the gray boxes that we hopefully tested earlier. It's starting to sound like a broken record because we've user test, but it's important. But you also want to make sure that the visual design is doing enhancements. And occasionally, hopefully not, but occasionally, sometimes the visual design can actually create issues. A lot of times this might actually be with something accessible. So that just takes a minor tweak or something like that. But making sure that everything is at this point pure enhancement. You want to make sure that your application is getting used and that it's providing value to your customers. You want to make sure that there aren't any friction points along your experience. At this point, if it needs to be done, something can be taken, hopefully not back to the drawing board, but again, tweaked so that it still creates a better experience, so that you still have a little bit of time generally before the actual release of your app goes out. Or if need be, it can be a fast follow developmentally, and you can do like a 1.1 or something shortly thereafter to fix something that does need to be fixed if something happens. But utilizing a clickable prototype to do this, it's going to look and feel like an app in a user's hand. So you're going to get a lot more of that emotion. You're going to get the thinking behind it with the visual design applied to it, and you'll get to hear the inner workings of their mind because we ask them to speak out or to think out loud. But you'll get some of that internal feedback voiced so that you can see how a user might actually be interacting with and touching this app, navigating through it without actually having to do any code work. I don't want to make it, it's not easy necessarily to put together a clickable prototype, but it's not as hard and it doesn't take as long to put together a clickable prototype than it is to develop an entire app. So this helps validate a lot of this stuff before a lot of that tough development happens, so that we're making sure, again, that our course is correct and that we're delivering maximum value to our customers.
Yeah, definitely. Simon, you mentioned something earlier about always returning to the goals and making sure that the work you're doing is in pursuit of those goals. And that was in the context of the user testing with that wireframe and IA phase. But the same thing is true for visual design as well. So designers kind of all shapes and sizes should always be returning to the goals of that project as that guiding North Star. If your design work or your visual design work kind of forsakes maybe those client stated goals in the pursuit of like making it look more cool or more slick, then ultimately that design failed. So you always need to have in mind those original goals and if the work you're doing is in pursuit of those. So that said, there is always, at least in my mind, the way the prototypes work, there's always a cool factor when you start to introduce interactivity in this, when things start to move, especially comparing it side by side directly with the static design. It's really similar to turning the pages of a book. Those static pages, even though nothing moves on them, just the movement between them starts to get different gears kind of turning in not only in your head, but also in a user's head to get a sense of how things start to relate to each other across screens. And that then can really bloom into this whole thought process about, what does this look like as a final product, and how certain things that appear in totally disparate places start to connect.
That's really interesting as well. And I think you both bring up a really good point, which is we're talking about just the idea of designing the user interface, right? There's still a much larger project that has to happen when it comes to developing out that actual application so that people can use it. So having a clickable prototype that's just in design has some functional elements based off of maybe the tool that you're using. We utilize Figma for anybody who's interested. Utilizing that tool can make it so that you can get a lot of user data, a lot of user testing from it without investing a lot into the actual development of that application yet. And that makes it so that you can be much more precise and efficient with your time as you go into that much heavier development phase.
Yeah, there's like a maximization of in all phases, going back to even the IA and wireframes. Those are both done with the consideration of well, we'll leave visual design to the next step because we're going to maximize what we need with these wireframes. And then that same thing is true for when you get to visual design, you kind of maximize what you can do with connecting these screens, building a prototype, like what is going to be the most useful things that you can do, bar actually leading up to the next step to make that next step jump a little bit smaller.
Drew, what I'm hearing from you is slow is fast. User testing helps you move faster, even if you have to take a bit more time in that area.
Definitely. There is value even in really short-term projects of taking a few minutes and listing out all your steps and being able to be like, I know I need to get something done very quickly, but I can take an hour or a half hour to do this step to make sure that I am like checking things off in a logical manner, because what's going to feel worse is having to go back and do that again and all the different implications that has to. So it's important to stay diligent even in the face of quick turnarounds. The process is a process and it's important to follow regardless of that.
Well, everybody, we are at that point in our panel discussion here where we want to open it up to the audience. For anybody who has any questions related to what we just talked about, right? We've gone through the process of designing a user interface for a mobile application, whether that's starting at that minimum viable product, prioritizing what you're actually going to be putting into your information architecture, validating that to create an actual low fidelity wireframe, validating that to then turn into that high fidelity design mockup. So we do have a few questions here that were sent in during the conversation beforehand. I'd love to hit that. If anybody has any questions right now, feel free to throw it in that Q&A section as well. We can tap onto those too. So Philip, this first one, it looks like is for you. And this person asks, for someone who doesn't have a lot of technical knowledge surrounding application design and development, I'm curious what steps you took to find a trusted partner to help you throughout this entire process.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I have zero, and I do mean zero, prior knowledge of building and developing any type of mobile application. So I was just relying on handy dandy Google or any word of mouth. So I reached out to several companies, one in the West Coast, one in the Northeast. They were fine. One big thing for me is communication. I'm actually a fairly very busy person. I wear several hats. So being able to have constant communication, or at least effective communication, was really vital for me. And as I said, I was looking through websites to see if whoever I went with was able to deliver what I had in my head. So, and then after some searching and looking on online reviews, I believe I used Clutch was also a really good tool that I used for some past clients of yours, testimonials. I gathered all that and I was able to talk with the team at Savas there. And as I mentioned, everybody was super nice, very communicative. I think I emailed Riley and I think he got back to me like that same day or something. So that's very great. And then Chelsea was also very instrumental in making sure I had all I needed to get started, introducing me to the team. So from there, I had very good vibes. I guess that's the saying nowadays, very good vibes from you guys. And the rest is history. And we were able to get it done quickly too, and on time. And I'm an on time kind of person. So to get it done, not only on time, but a little ahead of schedule too, was I made the right decision.
Good. So yeah, you can't underestimate the idea of vibes, right? The feeling that you get when it comes to working with people like Chelsea, the project manager on this project, Riley, our client strategist, who helped to design out how we would approach some of this. It sounds like communication is really important, making sure that you feel like you're being heard and you're getting your questions answered, maybe even being educated a little bit throughout that decision-making process. I'd say that's probably a really key point for that person to take away from this. I do have another question that came in, and this one looks like maybe it's more from the designer side, but I'd love to open it up to anybody. How long should it take to design a mobile application from idea to what you guys call high fidelity clickable prototypes?
Yeah, so like a lot of answers, it depends. Your main factors are like your overall scope. We've talked about determining features and MVP, and then the fidelity of both the design and the prototype functionality. You can get really close to replicating like a full app experience, but that is definitely going to put you on that lengthier timeline, because not only are you there's time and iterations there on the visual design front, but then also the iteration on the interactions and kind of fine tuning them, because when it comes to like should an object bounce up or fade in, or which direction, you can start to get into these really tiny decisions, and those stack up pretty quickly. So sometimes simply linking screens together with clickable hotspot is all you need. And something like that easily cuts kind of weeks off of that kind of more high fidelity host design and prototype example.
Yeah, just to add on to that, but to go along with what you said, I think of it kind of in three things. So application design, development, all that stuff, kind of dependent on three things: size of the app, size of the design team, size of the budget. And if you have the budget for it, you can throw multiple designers on it. That's going to speed up the process. If you only have one designer, but you have a lot of screens to design out, it's going to take a little bit longer. So it's one of those kind of vague, not super helpful answers, but it's because it is very dependent on those three things. But yeah, I think for Tornado, it took Drew and I 5-ish weeks. So, and that was moving pretty fast, but like Philip said, delivered it on time. So it just kind of depends on the project.
Perfect. Well, we did have one other question that came through. It was a question more about just whether or not this session was being recorded and would be shared. We answered that in the chat, but we'll answer it here as well. Yes, this entire session has been recorded. We are going to send that out after today's session kind of wraps up. So expect to see that in the next day or so. With that, though, I do want to highlight one other thing that's really important for anybody who's looking to action any information, any learnings from today. And that is how you actually start one of these projects. So for us at Savas Labs, we believe that any project, every project, any idea that you have needs to start with something we call discovery. So really what that means is taking the time to really understand, really document out, what are you trying to achieve, right? What does the functionality look like? Who are you trying to build this for? What are they looking for out of it? And then what are some of the requirements that are going to have to happen within it, whether that's the functionality that you need, whether that's the technology that you want to utilize, anything else in there. There's a lot that goes into discovery that makes it so that by the end, you actually know how you're going to attack that project, which I think a lot of people maybe struggle with because it requires a lot of experience and a lot of technical know-how. So with that, I would love to just put out there that if anybody has an application that they're looking to build, maybe has an existing application that they're looking to evolve, we would love the opportunity to share our experience with you in a discovery session. So you can find our URL of savaslabs.com/discovery session. You can sign up for a time slot where you can speak with one of our client strategists like Riley that Philip had talked about earlier. If you'd like, you can also just reach out to us directly at info@savaslabs.com. We'd be more than happy to set some time aside to help you make sure that we're communicating and hearing you like Philip was talking about earlier. That is a big strength of ours. With that said, I do have one major request for everybody who is on today's call, and that is feedback. Here at Savas Labs, we believe that feedback is really important for everybody to grow, whether that's us giving that to our clients, most certainly us collecting that from them, but also here today, us gathering some feedback from you. So I'm putting a link into the chat right now. It is a short 5-question survey. It should only take you a few minutes. We would very much love to hear a little bit more about what brought you in today and how your experience was with us. We'll also send that link out in our email following this with the link to the recording, so you'll have that there, but we would really appreciate your time there. And with that, I would like to say thank you. Thank you to our panelists for spending their time today talking through, sharing some of their experience and the lessons that they've learned throughout executing projects like this and many others. But also thank you to you all for attending here today. We hope that you found some value in today's conversation and have good ideas moving forward of how you might implement that with anything you're working on. If you have any other questions, please reach out to info@savaslabs.com. We'll be happy to answer those. And again, we'll be following up with some additional resources, including that recording later on this week. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.